What if knowledge is not a fortress, but a cage? What if the safety of answers, the comfort of doctrine, and the respect of the world are not pillars holding you up, but walls closing you in? Imagine a man who has built such a fortress around his soul. His name is Jalaluddin Rumi, a scholar of breathtaking intellect, a preacher whose words draw crowds in the thriving city of Konya, the jewel of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. It is the 13th century, a time of profound uncertainty, with the shadow of Mongol invasions having recently displaced his own family from their home in Balkh. In this fragile world, Rumi is a pillar of certainty. His life is a testament to order, a sacred architecture of jurisprudence, theology, and tradition inherited from his renowned father, Bahauddin Walad, the Sultan of the Scholars. He is a master of the outer sciences, a respected Islamic jurist issuing fatwas, a teacher shaping the minds of his devoted students. His world is built of books, of logical proofs, of a God understood through the pristine framework of sacred texts and the teachings of his masters, like the esteemed Burhan-ud-Din. Every day is a careful brick laid upon the last, constructing a tower of piety and reputation from which he surveys a world he believes he understands. The people of Konya see a spiritual leader, a man of immense gravity and learning, and they are not wrong. But what if the tower is also a prison? What if the man at its peak is staring at the horizon, unaware that the true immensity, the wild, untamable ocean of the divine, is not out there, but raging, silent and deep within himself? He has answers for everything, yet a question he has not yet learned how to ask is stirring in the depths of his soul. A profound, unspoken yearning for something more than knowledge, for a fire that books cannot provide, for a truth that cannot be debated but must be felt. The city of Konya hums with the commerce of the Silk Road, a crossroads of ideas and empires. Yet for all its worldly motion, the scholar's inner world is one of immaculate stillness. It is a world of perfect order, waiting for the perfect storm. What happens when a man who has all the answers meets a question in human form? What happens when a fortress, no matter how magnificent, is struck by a bolt of lightning? The story we think we know about Rumi, the poet of love and ecstatic whirling, is not where his journey begins. It is where his perfectly constructed world ends. This is not the story of a man who found God by climbing higher into the heavens of his intellect, but of one who found him in the wreckage after the tower fell. It is the story of how a scholar had to be broken, how his ink had to be spilled, how his carefully organized library of the soul had to be set ablaze, all by the arrival of a single, electrifying mystery. A mystery in the form of a wandering, homeless dervish known as Shams of Tabriz. And so our journey begins not with a poet, but with a preacher, a man convinced of his footing, standing at the edge of a cliff he does not know is there, moments before the ground gives way to the sky. The man who would ignite this fire was not a scholar, nor a prince, nor a man of any conventional standing. He was a phantom, a wanderer, a man known as Shams-e Tabrizi, the son of Tabriz. Born in 1185, he was a soul perpetually in motion, a rough-hewn mystic who lived among laborers and camel drivers, often weaving baskets or selling girdles to survive. He had no school, sought no followers, and was known to slip away the moment a crowd gathered around him. He was a spiritual seeker of the most radical kind, a man who had prayed for a single companion, someone vast enough to receive the torrent of divine knowledge that coursed through him. He was searching not for a student to teach, but for a mirror to see God in. That search, a pilgrimage of the heart across the Middle East, finally led him, on November 30, 1244, to the bustling streets of Konya. The accounts of their first meeting are the stuff of legend, each version a different facet of the same earth-shattering event. In one telling, Rumi, the esteemed professor, rides through the marketplace on his mule, surrounded by his adoring disciples. Shams, a stranger with eyes like burning coals, steps from the crowd, seizes the bridle, and poses a startling question. Who was greater, he demands, the Prophet Muhammad or the mystic Bayazid Bastami? The question is a trap. a paradox. Rumi, shocked by the audacity, answers correctly. Muhammad, of course, is the greatest of all. But Shams presses him. Then why did Muhammad say, "We have not known you as you should be known," while Bayezid cried out in ecstatic union, "Glory to me! How great is my majesty!" Rumi, the master of theology, understands the profound depth of the query. He explains that Bayezid's thirst was quenched by a single drop of divine knowledge, causing him to lose himself in ecstatic utterance, while Muhammad's capacity was like an endless ocean, forever expanding, his thirst for God ever increasing. The answer satisfies Shams, but the encounter shatters Rumi. It is a collision of two worlds, the intricate, ordered world of scholastic knowledge and the boundless, terrifying world of direct experience. In another, more dramatic version of the tale, Rumi is teaching by a fountain, a stack of precious, hand-copied books beside him. Shams, the unkempt stranger, approaches and asks what they are. Rumi dismissively replies, "Something you would not understand." In that instant, Shams sweeps the priceless manuscripts into the water. Rumi is aghast, his life's work destroyed. But Shams reaches into the pool and pulls the books out, one by one, and they are miraculously, impossibly dry. Rumi, stunned, asks for an explanation. Shams simply echoes his own words back to him. "This is something you cannot understand." In that moment, the world of books turned to dust. The knowledge he had spent a lifetime accumulating was revealed as a pale shadow of the living, burning reality that stood before him. This was Miracle Bahrain, the meeting of two seas, the confluence of the scholar's vast intellect and the mystic's endless heart. Everything in Rumi's life, his teaching, his preaching, his role as a pillar of the community, was abandoned. He took Shams into his own home, and for a period of intense communion, said to have lasted 40 days, the two were inseparable, locked away in spiritual retreat or sobit. What transpired in that seclusion is a sacred mystery. It was not a transmission of doctrine, but an annihilation of it. Shams was not a teacher in the conventional sense, he was a mirror. In Shams's presence, Rumi was forced to confront not just God, but himself. The pride of the scholar, the comfort of his reputation, the very architecture of his ego. Shams held up a mirror so pure that in it Rumi saw the divine presence. The esteemed professor fainted, and when he awoke, the man he had been was gone. A fire had been lit, a fire that would consume the scholar and give birth to the poet, the lover. But this fire was too bright for the world outside. The sun had descended upon Konya, and the shadows it cast were long and filled with envy. The sacred communion between the master scholar and the wandering dervish was a universe unto itself, a conversation that transcended words, a meeting of souls in a space beyond intellect and reason. But outside the walls of Rumi's home, in the courtyards of the madrasa and the whispers of the marketplace, a different story was being told. Rumi's students and followers who once hung on his every word now found themselves abandoned. Their beloved teacher, the man who was the center of their spiritual universe, had been stolen away by a wild-eyed, unkempt stranger of unknown origin. Jealousy, sharp and bitter, began to fester. They saw Shams not as a guide, but as a magician, a charlatan who had cast a spell over their master. The intimacy between the two men was scandalous. The scholar who had once filled the mosques with his sermons was now silent, lost to the world, absorbed entirely in the presence of this mysterious figure. The disciples, feeling orphaned and resentful, began to spread rumors. They maligned Shams's character, questioned his orthodoxy, and sowed seeds of discord throughout Konya. Their envy was a slow-acting poison, creating an atmosphere of hostility and suspicion that even the profound love between Rumi and Shams could not entirely ignore. This worldly intrusion, this static of resentment, became unbearable for Shams. He was a wanderer by nature, a bird never meant for a cage, even a gilded one of love and devotion. Seeing the pain his presence was causing, and perhaps to teach Rumi his first brutal lesson in separation, Shams vanished. One day in 1246, without a word of warning, he was simply gone. The sun had disappeared from the sky. For Rumi, the departure was not a simple absence, it was an amputation. The world, which had just burst into vibrant divine color, was suddenly drained to a bleak monochrome. The silence left by Shams was not peaceful, it was a deafening roar of grief. The scholar who had abandoned his books now found himself in a state of torment that no book could explain. He was frantic, lost. He wandered the streets of Konya, his eyes searching every face, every shadow for the one who had become his soul's mirror. The pain of this separation was the crucible in which the poet was truly forged. It was in this desperate, agonizing longing that Rumi began to compose his first verses of poetry, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a raw, primal cry from a heart torn in two. His grief was so profound, so all-consuming, that it moved his family and even the resentful disciples. Finally, realizing the depth of the wound they had helped inflict, a plan was made. Rumi learned that Shams might have traveled to Damascus. He entrusted his own son, the loyal and devoted Sultan Walad, with the sacred mission of finding the lost son and pleading for his return. Sultan Walad, a figure of immense importance who would later organize and preserve his father's legacy, embarked on the journey. He found Shams in Damascus, and with heartfelt apologies and promises of safety, convinced the wanderer to come back to Konya. The return of Shams was a moment of ecstatic reunion. The sun rose again over the city, and for a fragile, precious time, the divine conversation resumed. Rumi's joy was boundless. He gave his daughter-in-law to Shams in marriage, binding him to his family, hoping to anchor the restless spirit to Konya forever. But the shadows had not truly receded. The envy of the disciples had been suppressed, not vanquished. The brief peace was merely the calm before the final, devastating storm. The second act of this divine drama was about to end, and its final curtain would fall in a night of blood and mystery, leaving a ruin so complete that from it, a new kind of God could be born. The second union was a fragile dawn, a precious and tenuous peace. For a time, the divine friendship flourished once more within the walls of Rumi's home, a sanctuary against the simmering resentment that still lingered outside. Rumi, desperate to tether his spiritual son to the earth of Konya, integrated Shams fully into his family. But this very act of binding, of trying to domesticate a force as wild and untamable as Shams, only intensified the jealousy of those who felt displaced. The core group of disciples, now joined by Rumi's own son, Jalaluddin, saw Shams not just as a rival for their master's affection, but as a permanent fixture usurping their rightful place. The whispers returned, more venomous this time. The plots grew darker. They could not abide this stranger's hold on the man they revered. They decided that if the sun would not leave on its own, it would have to be extinguished. One night in the year 1248, the darkness gathered. According to the most persistent and brutal accounts, a small group of conspirators, which some traditions claim included Rumi's own son, lured Shams to a back door. He stepped outside, knowing what awaited him. A cry was heard, and then silence. When Rumi came to look for his friend, all he found were a few drops of blood on the stone, glistening in the moonlight. Shams of Tabriz had vanished from the face of the earth. This time, there was no rumor of a journey to Damascus. This was an absolute, violent, and final disappearance. The mystery of that night has never been fully solved. Some say Shams was murdered and his body cast into a well. Others believe he was not killed, but, sensing the imminent danger, simply slipped away into the night, vanishing forever into the anonymity of the wandering dervish, eventually dying in the town of Khoi. But for Rumi, the specifics did not matter. The result was the same. The sun had been murdered from his sky. His world did not just crack, it disintegrated. The grief that followed was not the melancholic pining of the first separation. It was a cataclysm, a descent into a black hole of despair. Rumi refused to believe Shams was dead. For 2 years, he searched, a frantic, grief-stricken seeker. He journeyed twice to Damascus himself, a desperate pilgrimage to find the ghost of his friend. He walked the streets, peered into every tavern and caravanserai, his heart leaping at every tall, gaunt figure, only to have it break again and again. The scholar who once commanded audiences with his profound learning was now a man seemingly gone mad with love and loss, a haunting figure pacing the ancient city, a walking embodiment of divine longing. It was during this final, agonizing search in Damascus that the great turning occurred. In the depths of his despair, after every hope of finding Shams in the external world had been exhausted, a devastating and liberating realization dawned upon him. He was searching for the sun outside of himself, but the sun had never been merely an external person. Shams was a mirror. The divine light Rumi had seen in his friend was a reflection of the light within his own soul. He had been searching for his own heart. He expressed this cataclysmic insight in a famous verse: "Why should I seek? I am the same as he. His essence speaks through me. I have been looking for myself." With that, the search ended. Rumi returned to Konya, not with his friend, but having become his friend. He had gone to find a man and had instead found God, not in a mosque or a book, but in the smoldering, desolate ruins of his own heart. The devastation was complete, and it was in that perfect ruin that the true mystic was born. The man known as Jalaluddin, the scholar, was dead. From his ashes rose Rumi, the poet of fire. The man who returned from Damascus was a stranger to those who knew him. The sober preacher, the esteemed jurist, was gone. In his place was a being consumed by a fire that burned away all traces of his former self. The grief for Shams was no longer a weight that crushed him. It had become the very fuel of his existence. He had discovered that the agony of separation was itself a form of divine communion. The wound of loss was not a void, but a sacred space, an opening through which the light of the beloved could pour in. This was the birth of the poet. Rumi, who before Shams had perhaps composed no poetry, now found language utterly transformed. Words were no longer tools for constructing logical arguments, they were vessels for a torrent of ecstatic emotion. He began to write, not with the deliberate hand of a scholar, but as if taking dictation from a voice that erupted from the ruins of his heart. Out of this volcano of grief and love came the thousands of lyric poems that would form his masterpiece, the Divan-i Shams, Tabrizi, the collected poems of Shams of Tabriz. In a supreme act of mystical annihilation, Rumi did not even sign these poems with his own name. He wrote them in the voice of Shams, attributing his own genius to his lost friend, for he no longer saw a distinction between them. Shams was the speaker, and Rumi was the channel. This was the ultimate expression of Fana, the Sufi concept of the annihilation of the self, the dying before one dies. The ego of Jalaluddin, the scholar, had been so completely effaced that only the beloved, personified by Shams, remained. "I have become you," he wrote, "and you have become me. I am the body, you are the soul. Let no one say hereafter that I am other than you." His poetry was a revolution. It was not the carefully crafted verse of court poets. It was raw, immediate, and pulsating with a wild energy. He wrote of the soul as a reed flute, torn from the reed bed of its divine origin, forever crying out with a song of longing to return. He wrote of love as a fire that burns away everything but God, of the heart as a tavern of ruin where one becomes drunk on the wine of divine presence. These were not just metaphors, they were lived realities. The ruins of his old life became the central landscape of his new spiritual world. It was in this state of transformed consciousness that Rumi discovered a new form of prayer, a physical manifestation of his soul's ecstatic state, the sama, the famous whirling dance. Legend holds that one day, walking through the goldsmith's quarter of Konya, he heard the rhythmic hammering of the artisans, and in that beat, he heard the name of God. Allah, Allah, Allah. He was overcome. He raised his arms, one to the heavens, to receive divine grace, the other to the earth, to channel it to the world, and he began to turn. He began to whirl, not as a performance, but as a prayer. The dance was a microcosm of the universe. It was the planets orbiting the sun, the moth circling the flame, the soul turning in ecstatic surrender around the axis of the divine truth. It was a physical enactment of his spiritual reality, abandoning the ego, dissolving the self, and finding one's true center in the constant, dynamic motion of divine love. The scholar who once stood still and preached from a pulpit now found God in a dance that spun him into the very heart of existence. The fortress of certainty was a pile of rubble, and in its place, Rumi was building a whirling, dancing, singing cathedral of love. The transformation was total. The static, predictable world of the scholar had been replaced by the dynamic, ecstatic orbit of the lover. The sama, the whirling meditation, was not merely an outlet for grief. It was a profound spiritual technology, a way of physically embodying the highest truths of Sufi mysticism. In the act of turning, the dervish becomes a living axis between heaven and earth. The right hand, palm up, receives the boundless grace of the divine. The left hand, palm down, transmits that grace into the world. The white robe, the tenure, represents the shroud of the ego which is cast off in the dance. The tall felt hat, the sika, is the tombstone of that same ego. To whirl is to be born into a new reality. It is a journey of spiritual ascent, a mystical flight that takes the seeker through the abandonment of the self to a state of union with the perfect one. This was Rumi's answer to the pain of separation. If the beloved was absent in the world, he would find him in the ecstatic dissolution of the self. This practice became the cornerstone of the Mevlevi order, the fraternity of whirling dervishes that his son, Sultan Walid, would later formally establish to preserve and propagate his father's teachings. But Rumi's new path was not one of solitary ecstasy. The love that had shattered him also remade him into a guide for others. He had journeyed into the abyss of loss and returned with a map, not of the heavens, but of the human heart. His teachings, once based on scripture and law, now flowed from the raw, living spring of his own experience. He taught that divine love was the fundamental reality of the universe, the creative force that set the cosmos in motion, and the ultimate destination of every soul. For Rumi, this love was not a soft, sentimental feeling. It was a powerful, transformative force, an ishqa that demanded the complete surrender of the self. Love is the remedy for our pride and self-conceit, he proclaimed, the physician of all our infirmities. This divine love, he taught, was the answer to the soul's profound sense of separation, its homesickness for its divine origin. Having found his own way home through the ruins of his heart, he now showed others the way. He attracted a new circle of devoted companions, not just scholars, but artisans, merchants, and common people drawn to the warmth of his immense heart. His most significant companion in these later years was Husam al-Din Chalabi. It was at Husam's urging that Rumi embarked on his final, monumental work, the Masnavi-i-Manavi, or spiritual couplets. Unlike the fiery lyrical outpourings of the Divan, the Masnavi was a vast 6-volume ocean of wisdom, a tapestry of fables, Quranic interpretations, everyday anecdotes, and profound mystical teachings woven together. Often called the Quran in Persian, it was a guide for the soul's journey back to God. The central theme remained the same, the quest for union with the beloved. But now the wild personal grief for Shams had matured into a universal call for all of humanity to awaken to the divine love that lies dormant within. The reed flute's lament that opens the Masnavi is the voice of every soul, yearning for the wholeness it lost the moment it was separated from the source. The scholar had been consumed, the lover had been born, and now the lover was becoming a lighthouse, his broken heart shining a light for every lost ship on the vast ocean of existence. The Masnavi became the testament of a man who had traveled to the furthest shores of sorrow and returned with the secrets of the sea. It was not a book of rules, but a book of echoes, where every story, every parable was designed to awaken a memory in the soul of the reader, the memory of its own divine nature. Rumi, guided by the patient encouragement of his beloved scribe and companion, Hussam Chalabi, poured the wisdom of his transformed life into its pages. The 6 books of the epic poem map out a vast spiritual geography. The first 2 books delve into the treacherous territory of the nafs, the lower, carnal self, with its deceptions and egoistic tendencies. The middle books explore the realms of reason and knowledge, personified by figures like the prophet Moses, showing both their power and their ultimate limitations in the face of divine mystery. Finally, the last 2 books ascend to the ultimate Sufi ideal, that to truly comprehend God's existence, one must be willing to annihilate one's own earthly, physical self. This is the final stage of the journey, the concept of fana, where the drop of the individual ego dissolves back into the infinite ocean of the divine. This was the lesson Shams had taught Rumi through his devastating absence. The Masnavi was Rumi's way of teaching it to the world. He used stories of kings and slaves, of animals and fools, simple tales that operated on multiple levels, speaking to the common person and the advanced mystic simultaneously. Through these narratives, he explored the central paradoxes of the spiritual path, that strength is found in surrender, that knowledge is found in unknowing, that life is found in dying to the self. Die before you die, he urged, echoing a core tenet of Sufism, the idea that by annihilating the ego in this life, one awakens to the eternal life of the spirit. His philosophy was one of radical inclusion. The love he spoke of was not exclusive to Muslims, but was a universal force available to all of humanity. Come, come, whoever you are, one of his most famous quatrains invites, wanderer, worshipper, lover of leaving. It doesn't matter. Ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, even if you have broken your vows 1,000 times. Come, yet again, come, come. He saw the divine presence reflected in all of creation, in every faith, in every being. This love was a force that transcended all worldly divisions and religious dogma, uniting everything in a sacred dance of existence. The Tavern of Ruin he so often wrote about was a symbol for this space beyond right and wrong, a place where the soul could shed its pious self-image and encounter God in the most raw and authentic way. For Rumi, God was not a distant, judging monarch in the heavens, but an intimate, all-encompassing presence, the beloved whose voice could be heard in the hammering of a goldsmith, in the cry of a flute, and most profoundly, in the silence of a broken and surrendered heart. The ruins had become his sanctuary. The loss had become his greatest gift. The pain of separation had revealed the secret of eternal union. What Shams had shattered was not Rumi's faith, but the cage that had confined it. And in that freedom, Rumi taught not what he had learned from books, but what he had learned from the fire. The legacy of a man who found God in the ruins is not a doctrine carved in stone, but a river of love that flows through time, nourishing the arid landscapes of the human heart. Rumi's final years in Konya were not a quiet retirement, but the vibrant center of a spiritual renaissance. The Mevlevi order, which coalesced around his teachings, became a vessel for his unique path of love, preserving the sacred practice of the Soma as a living, breathing form of worship. His influence radiated outward, transforming Konya into a beacon of mystical insight. He was no longer just a local preacher, he was a spiritual sun in his own right, his warmth drawing seekers from across the Persianate world and beyond. His final illness was seen not as a tragedy, but as the ultimate wedding night, the Urs, the final union with the beloved he had longed for his entire life. When he died on December 17, 1273, his funeral was a testament to the universality of his message. It was attended not only by his Muslim followers, but by Christians, Jews, and people of all walks of life, each group mourning the loss of a soul who had spoken to the deepest truths of their own traditions. He was laid to rest beside his father, and over his tomb a magnificent shrine was erected, a green dome that would become one of the most sacred pilgrimage sites in the Islamic world. His son, Sultan Walad, and his successor, Hussam Chalabi, meticulously preserved his teachings, ensuring that the torrent of his poetry was collected and that the flame of his wisdom would not be extinguished. Sultan Walid, in particular, played the crucial role of the organizer, the one who gave structure to his father's spontaneous outpourings, allowing the Mevlevi path to endure for centuries. But Rumi's true legacy transcends any single order or institution. It lies in the immortal verses that continue to be recited, chanted, and sung across the globe. His words have a unique ability to cross the boundaries of culture, religion, and time. In the war-torn Middle East, refugees have found solace in his verses. In the West, his poetry has become a source of profound spiritual guidance for millions seeking a connection to the divine that transcends dogma. He speaks a universal language, the language of the heart's longing for home. He reminds us that the quest for divine love is the central theme of the human condition. He teaches that the ego is the primary barrier to spiritual growth, and that the path to enlightenment is a journey from self-centeredness to selflessness. The story of Rumi is the ultimate paradox. It is the story of how a man of profound knowledge had to embrace unknowing, how a man of immense public standing had to be humbled and broken, how a heart shattered by the loss of a single beloved friend could expand to embrace all of humanity. He shows us that our deepest wounds are not sources of shame, but portals to the divine. The wound, he famously wrote, is the place where the light enters you. Rumi didn't find God in the pristine heavens of theological perfection. He found him in the messy, painful, beautiful ruins of a life torn apart by love. His journey is an eternal invitation to have the courage to let our own certainties crumble, to embrace the devastation, and to listen for the music that begins only when the walls fall down. It is an invitation to dance in the ruins, for it is there, and only there, that we can find the beloved who has been waiting for us all along, not in the sky, but in the deepest chamber of our own surrendered heart. The fortress of the mind, with its high walls of doctrine and its sturdy gates of logic, offers a tempting illusion of safety. Within its confines, the world is orderly, predictable. God is a concept to be studied, a king to be obeyed, a truth to be defined and defended. This was the world of Jalaluddin Rumi, the celebrated scholar of 13th century Konya, a man whose intellectual and spiritual authority was as solid and respected as the stone walls of the city itself. He was the inheritor of a profound scholastic legacy, a master of theology and law, a man who had dedicated his life to building a magnificent structure of knowledge in service of his faith. His path to God was a ladder of learning, each book a rung, each debate a step closer to the heavens. But what if the ladder leads only to the top of the wall and not to the sky itself? What if the real journey is not an ascent, but a demolition? This is the profound question posed by Rumi's life, a question that was not asked in words, but in fire. The fire was a man, Shams of Tabriz, a wandering, untamed mystic who appeared like a comet in the ordered cosmos of Rumi's life. Their meeting on November 30th, 1244, was not a discussion, it was a detonation. Shams was not a teacher who offered new information, he was a mirror who shattered an old identity. The legends of their encounter are books thrown in water that emerged dry, of paradoxical questions that dissolved the foundations of reason. All point to a single cataclysmic truth. The knowledge that can be written and debated is but a shadow of the truth that must be lived and experienced. Rumi, the master of the shadow, was suddenly face to face with the sun. The intense, exclusive friendship that followed was a scandal in Konya. Rumi abandoned his pulpit, his students, his public life to enter into a sacred retreat, a sobit, with this enigmatic stranger. In that seclusion, the entire structure of his scholarly self began to crumble. Shams challenged his pride, his reliance on intellect, and the very ego that had been nourished by public acclaim. He was teaching Rumi the terrifying art of spiritual emptiness, the necessity of becoming a hollow reed so that the divine breath could flow through. But this burning away of the self was seen by the world outside as madness. Jealousy and suspicion festered among Rumi's disciples, who saw their master enchanted by a dangerous sorcerer. Their hostility created a pressure that the free-spirited Shams would not endure. He vanished, leaving Rumi to face the first devastating echo of silence. The scholar's grief was immense, a torment that could only be soothed when his devoted son, Sultan Walad, journeyed to Damascus and persuaded the mystic to return. This reunion, however, was a fragile peace. The underlying resentment in Konya had not disappeared, it had merely coiled, waiting to strike. The second and final vanishing of Shams was an act of brutal finality. Whether he was murdered by a cabal of jealous disciples, as many accounts suggest, or whether he simply slipped away to escape their hatred, the effect on Rumi was the same. The sun was ripped from his universe, and his world plunged into an abyss of absolute ruin. This was not just the loss of a friend, it was the death of God as he had known him. The reliable, accessible, divine presence was gone, and in its place was a void of terrifying magnitude. It was in this ultimate ruin, the ruin of his heart, his hope, his very reason for being, that the true miracle occurred. After a desperate, frantic search for Shams in the external world, Rumi finally collapsed inward and made the discovery that would define his legacy and change the course of mystical poetry forever. He realized that the light he was searching for was not in Shams, but was shining through Shams. The dervish had been a mirror reflecting the divine beauty hidden within Rumi's own soul. The search was over. He had been looking for himself. "I am he declared, and in that declaration, the separation between lover and beloved, seeker and sought, dissolved. The scholar Jalaluddin was dead, annihilated in the crucible of his grief. From those ashes, the poet Rumi was born. His sorrow transmuted into song, an ecstatic torrent of tens of thousands of verses that became the Divan-i-Shams, Tabrizi. He did not write about love. Love wrote through him. His grief found a physical language in the whirling dance of the Sama, a meditation in motion where the self is abandoned and the soul orbits its divine center. The ruin had become a sacred space. The pain had become a portal. He had discovered that God is not found in the pristine perfection of our constructed beliefs, but in the beautiful brokenness of an open heart. He went on to compose the Masnavi, a 6-volume spiritual epic, to guide others on the same journey from the ego's fortress to the boundless, open field of divine love. His message was timeless and universal. The wound is where the light enters. Rumi's story is a testament to the transformative power of devastation. It reveals that true spiritual awakening is not an accumulation, but a stripping away, not a construction, but a collapse. It is the story of a man who had all the answers, but only found the truth when he was left with nothing but a single, burning question. And the answer he found was not a word, but a dance in the magnificent ruins of his own surrendered heart. What is a human soul, if not a fortress built of memories, beliefs, and a carefully constructed sense of self? We spend our lives reinforcing its walls, decorating its rooms, and memorizing its every corridor, believing that within this structure lies our safety, our identity. This fortress was the world of Jalaluddin Rumi, but his was no ordinary dwelling. It was a cathedral of the intellect, built by one of the most brilliant minds of the 13th century. A respected scholar in Konya, the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, he was a man whose every stone of belief was perfectly placed, whose every archway of logic was flawless. His life was a monument to order and tradition, inherited from his father, Bahauddin Walad, the Sultan of Scholars. To the world, he was a guide, a teacher, a pillar of certainty in an age of chaos. His path to God was paved with the sacred texts and commentaries that filled his library, a straight and well-lit road leading upward to a predictable heaven. But what if God is not at the end of the road, but in the earthquake that breaks it apart? What if the true path is not one of careful construction, but of glorious, unavoidable ruin? The earthquake had a name, Shams of Tabriz. He was not a scholar, but a wanderer, not a man of letters, but a man of fire. He was a walking paradox, a homeless dervish who possessed the keys to an invisible kingdom. His arrival in Konya in 1244 was the tremor that would bring the cathedral of Rumi's intellect crashing down. Their first encounter, retold in countless mystical legends, was a collision of two universes. Whether it was Shams's impossible questions that short-circuited Rumi's theological mind, or the miracle of throwing his precious books into water only to retrieve them bone dry, the message was the same: the reality you have so carefully constructed is an illusion. The life of the mind is a pale reflection of the fire of existence. Stunned into a new reality, Rumi abandoned everything: his students, his pulpit, his public identity, to enter into a period of intense spiritual communion with this human enigma. Locked away from the world, Shams acted not as a teacher, but as a demolition expert for the soul. He dismantled Rumi's pride, his reliance on second-hand knowledge, and the subtle arrogance of the scholar. He was emptying the vessel, preparing it for a wine it had never known. This radical transformation was incomprehensible to Rumi's followers. They saw their master bewitched, his wisdom stolen by an unkempt madman. Their jealousy and resentment grew into a toxic cloud that eventually drove Shams from Konya. Rumi's first taste of separation was an agony that birthed his first poems, cries of a heart learning the language of longing. Through the efforts of his son, Sultan Walad, Shams was persuaded to return, but the reunion was short-lived. The darkness of human envy had not been dispelled. The final disappearance of Shams in 1248 was an act of brutal erasure. The most credible accounts speak of a murder, a plot hatched by resentful disciples, perhaps even including one of Rumi's own sons, who lured Shams into the night and silenced him forever. For Rumi, the world ended. The sun was gone. The mirror was shattered. The connection to the divine that he had just discovered was severed. This was the ultimate ruin. It was the collapse of his heart, the raising of his spirit, a descent into a void so profound that no light could seem to penetrate it. He searched for Shams like a madman, journeying to Damascus, seeking a ghost in the crowded streets. But it was there, in the deepest pit of his despair, that he found the truth. The external search was futile because what he was looking for was not a person, but a presence. The divine light of Shams was a reflection of the divine light that had been dormant within his own soul. The seeker and the sought were one and the same. In that moment of annihilation, the scholar died and the mystic was born. The ruin was not an ending, but a beginning. The empty space left by Shams became the canvas for an explosion of divine art. His grief became a creative force of unimaginable power, pouring out as the tens of thousands of ecstatic odes of the Divani Shams. Tabrizi, a collection of poems where Rumi speaks not in his own voice, but in the voice of his lost beloved. His body learned a new way to pray, the whirling dance of the summer, a physical surrender to the cosmic motion of love, a way of becoming a living conduit between the heavens and the earth. His later masterpiece, the Masnavi, became a 6-volume map of the soul's journey home, a guide for others through the ruins that he had navigated. He taught that suffering is not a curse, but a divine chisel, carving away the excess stone of the ego to reveal the perfect form of the soul within. Rumi's life is the ultimate testament that spiritual awakening is often a process of demolition. It is about having the courage to stand in the wreckage of who you thought you were and to discover the indestructible presence of who you have always been. He didn't find God by perfecting his fortress. He found him in the wild, sacred, and liberating expanse of its ruins. His legacy is not a set of beliefs, but an invitation to let your own walls crumble and to learn to dance in the rubble. Imagine a world built of words, a universe confined to the pages of ancient books. In this world, God is a subject to be mastered, a truth to be captured in the intricate net of grammar and theology. The master of this world was Jalaluddin Rumi, a scholar of immense repute in 13th century Konya. His life was a library, each day a new volume of learning, each sermon a carefully indexed chapter. He inherited this kingdom of the intellect from his father, himself a sultan of the scholars, and he ruled it with wisdom and grace. His students revered him, the city honored him, and his path seemed clear, a lifetime of scholarship, teaching, and piety. Yet, within the quiet corridors of this library of the soul, an unread book remained, the book of the heart, written in a language of fire he did not yet understand. The one who would teach him this language was a man who owned no books at all. His name was Shams of Tabriz, a wandering dervish, a spiritual vagabond whose only scripture was the living presence of the divine. He was the son to Rumi's world of candlelight, and his arrival in 1244 was an event that would set the library ablaze. Their meeting was an intellectual cataclysm. The legends speak of a confrontation where Rumi's scholarly knowledge was rendered powerless. Shams challenged him not with superior arguments, but with a reality that defied explanation. By demonstrating that the physical laws governing books could be suspended by a higher power, he showed Rumi that the world of academia was a child's game compared to the spiritual world of direct experience. In an instant, Rumi the scholar became Rumi the seeker. He cast aside his robes of authority, turned his back on his students, and closeted himself with this mysterious sunman. For months they engaged in sohbet, a mystical communion so profound that it dissolved the boundaries between them. Shams was not adding to Rumi's library, he was burning it down, page by page. He was erasing the pride, the reliance on reason, the identity of the great teacher, to make way for the birth of the humble lover. This total absorption in Shams was a scandal. To Rumi's disciples, it was an abduction. Their teacher had been stolen by a captivating but dangerous force, and their jealousy poisoned the air in Konya. Unable to bear the hostility, Shams disappeared, plunging Rumi into his first winter of grief. It was a cold, desolate sorrow, a longing that began to spill out in the unfamiliar form of poetry. Rumi sent his son, Sultan Walad, to find the dervish and bring him back, and for a brief, hopeful season, the son returned to Konya. But the second coming was fated to end in a deeper tragedy. The disciples' envy, now curdled into a dark plot, led to the final, violent vanishing of Shams in 1248. Accounts point to a grim murder in the night, a conspiracy to extinguish the light that had so captivated their master. This time the loss was absolute. It was not a departure, but an annihilation. Rumi's world was not just shaken, it was pulverized. The library was reduced to ashes. The foundation of his faith, which had become synonymous with his love for Shams, was gone. This was the great ruin. He searched frantically, a ghost haunting the road to Damascus, until the devastating truth finally broke through the storm of his grief. He could not find Shams because he was Shams. The friend he was seeking was a mirror for the divine beloved hidden within his own soul. He had not lost his connection to God. He had only lost the external reflection of it. With this realization, the frantic search outward transformed into a profound discovery inward. The pain of separation became the ultimate state of union. It was in the ruins of his former self that Rumi found the indestructible foundation of divine love. His response to this catastrophe was not despair, but an explosion of creativity. The scholar's silence was broken by the poet's roar. The Divani Shams I Tabrizi flowed from him, a river of ecstatic verse dedicated to the friend who had become his own soul. He began to whirl, discovering in the dance of the Sama a way to physically embody the soul's surrender to the beloved. The static world of the book was replaced by the turning cosmos of the dance. In his later years, he dictated the Masnavi, the great ocean of mystical wisdom, a work that codified the journey from the brokenness of the ego to the wholeness of divine union. He had learned the ultimate lesson, that the human heart, like a seed, cannot grow until it is broken open. The pristine, untouched library was a sterile place. Only when its walls were shattered and its books turned to ash could the wild, beautiful garden of divine love begin to grow. Rumi's legacy is this garden, a place where all are invited to witness the miracle of life sprouting from the ruins. The journey of the soul is often imagined as a climb, an ascent from the darkness of the world to the light of the heavens. We picture it as the construction of a great tower of virtue and knowledge, built piece by piece, prayer by prayer, until we reach God. This was the path that Jalaluddin Rumi, the preeminent religious scholar of 13th century Konya, had mastered. His life was a masterwork of spiritual architecture. His intellect was legendary, his piety unimpeachable. He was the chief inheritor and guardian of a profound theological tradition, a man who gave sermons in the great mosques and guided his students through the complexities of Islamic law and scripture. His tower of certainty stood tall and magnificent, a landmark of faith in a tumultuous world. But the story of Rumi is not about the building of this tower, it is about its complete and utter destruction. For what if the true path to the divine is not a climb, but a collapse? The force that leveled Rumi's world was a wandering holy man, Shams of Tabriz, a mystic who carried the entirety of his wisdom not in books, but in his blazing heart. His arrival in Konya was the seismic event that revealed the Tower of Rumi's learning to be built on sand. Their legendary first meeting was a spiritual ambush. Shams, with his shocking questions and inexplicable miracles, demonstrated to the great scholar that all of his accumulated knowledge was a flickering candle compared to the sun of direct, divine experience. The encounter left Rumi shattered, but in the cracks, a new light began to shine. He turned his back on his former life, forsaking his public duties and reputation to enter into an all-consuming spiritual friendship. For Rumi, Shams was the living embodiment of the beloved, a human mirror reflecting the face of God. This sacred intimacy, however, was viewed as a sacrilege by Rumi's followers. Consumed by jealousy, they created an atmosphere of such intense hostility that Shams was forced to leave Konya. Rumi's desolation was profound. In the agony of this separation, he first discovered the voice of the poet within him, a voice that sang of longing and the pain of absence. He dispatched his own son, Sultan Walad, to bring Shams back, and for a while the broken world was made whole again. But the reunion was tragically brief. The resentment of the disciples had hardened into a murderous resolve. In 1248, Shams was lured from Rumi's house and disappeared into the night, the victim of a violent conspiracy. This time, the loss was absolute. This was the final ruin. The tower did not just crack, it was leveled to the ground. Every certainty Rumi had ever held, every structure of belief, every hope for earthly companionship with the divine was obliterated. The grief that followed was a black ocean. Rumi, the great scholar, was now the great wanderer, searching desperately for a trace of his lost friend, a pilgrimage of pain that led him to the streets of Damascus. It was there, at the nadir of his despair, having exhausted every external search, that he was forced to turn inward. And what he found there changed everything. He found Shams. He realized that the divine presence he had experienced through his friend was not external. Shams had been a key that unlocked a door within Rumi's own soul. The beloved he had been searching for was and always had been within him. The devastation of his loss had cleared the ground, demolishing the tower of the ego and revealing the indestructible foundation of the true self. This realization was a volcanic eruption of creative and spiritual energy. The sorrow did not vanish, but it was transformed into a celebration of divine love. He began to compose thousands of ecstatic poems, the Divan-i-Shams i Tabrizi, signing them not with his own name, but with that of the friend who now lived within him. He began to whirl, creating the Sema dance as a physical expression of the soul's joyous surrender to the gravitational pull of God. The ruins of his life became his temple. The collapse of his intellect opened the door to the wisdom of the heart. From this sacred rubble, he would later build his most enduring monument, the Masnavi, the epic poem that serves as a guide for every soul yearning to find its way home. Rumi's journey teaches us the terrifying and liberating truth that the path to God is often through the wreckage of our own lives. It is a story that challenges us to question the safety of our own towers of certainty and to consider that the most profound spiritual breakthroughs do not happen when we are climbing, but when we have the courage to fall. He found God not in the perfection of his knowledge, but in the beautiful, sacred ruins of his broken heart. In the grand architecture of faith, we often seek shelter in structures of certainty. We build our spiritual lives like fortified cities with walls of doctrine and towers of intellectual understanding. In the 13th century, few cities of the soul were as magnificent as that of Jalaluddin Rumi. A scholar of unparalleled brilliance in Konya, he was the master architect of his own faith, a man whose knowledge of scripture and theology was both his fortress and his crown. He was a guide to others, a man of answers, secure in a world he had meticulously mapped through the sacred texts. His life was a testament to the power of the learned mind to grasp the nature of God. But the greatest mystics are not those who build the most impressive fortresses, but those who have the courage to walk out of them and into the wild, open, and often terrifying landscape of direct experience. Rumi's journey into that wilderness began with the arrival of a human earthquake named Shams of Tabriz. Shams was a wanderer who carried no books and built no institutions. His only temple was the boundless expanse of his own awakened heart. When he met Rumi in 1244, it was not a meeting of minds, but a collision of worlds. Through enigmatic challenges and displays of spiritual power that defied Rumi's logic, Shams exposed the limitations of intellect. He demonstrated that 1,000 books about the sun are no substitute for feeling its warmth. This revelation was the first crack in the fortress walls. Rumi, humbled and hungry for this new reality, abandoned his scholarly life to become the student of this mysterious master. Their intense companionship was a fire that began to purify Rumi of all his attachments to his reputation, his pride, and his intellectual self-reliance. But this fire was too bright for the onlookers. Rumi's disciples, feeling abandoned and deeply jealous of Shams's influence, began a campaign of whispers and threats that drove the dervish away. The pain of this first separation was Rumi's initiation into the path of longing. It was in this state of heartbroken yearning that his poetic voice was born. He succeeded in bringing Shams back to Konya, but the reprieve was temporary. The jealousy of his followers had festered, leading to the final violent disappearance of Shams, who was likely murdered by those who could not tolerate his power over their master. This was the event that leveled the fortress. The loss of Shams was not just the loss of a friend, it was the collapse of Rumi's entire spiritual world. The mirror in which he had seen the face of God was shattered. The center could not hold. He was left in a state of absolute ruin, a king wandering in the rubble of his own fallen kingdom. His desperate search for his friend was, in truth, a search for the divine presence that had vanished from his life. It was only when this external search failed completely that he was forced to dig in the rubble of his own heart. And there, buried beneath the grief and despair, he found the treasure. He discovered that Shams had never been the source of the light, but the one who had forced him to open his own eyes. The divine beloved was not an external person who could be lost, but an eternal presence within. This discovery did not end his sorrow, but it transformed it into a force of creation. The ruins became the fertile ground for a new kind of life. His grief poured out in an endless stream of poetry, the Divan-i Shams-i Tabrizi, a testament to a love that had transcended separation and death. His body discovered the language of the summer, the whirling dance that is a physical manifestation of the soul's annihilation in God. The man who was once a static pillar of knowledge became a dynamic whirlwind of love. From this transformed consciousness, he later created the Masnavi, his 6-volume masterpiece that guides the reader on the same journey from the confinement of the ego to the freedom of the soul. Rumi's story is a powerful parable for the spiritual journey. It teaches that our carefully constructed certainties can become our prisons. It shows that true transformation often requires a painful disintegration of the self we thought we were. He found God not by adding another stone to his fortress of knowledge, but by standing in its ruins, open and vulnerable to the sky. His life is an invitation to honor our own moments of collapse, to see them not as failures, but as sacred opportunities for the divine to rebuild us in a new, more magnificent form, not of stone, but of light. The world reveres the finished cathedral, the polished diamond, the perfected work of art. We are drawn to strength, certainty, and completion. But the mystical path whispers a different truth, that the divine is found not in what is flawless, but in what is beautifully broken. The life of Jalaluddin Rumi is the most profound expression of this secret. He began as a man of immense spiritual and intellectual wholeness. As a leading scholar in 13th century Konya, his faith was a fortress of scripture and law, perfectly constructed and seemingly impregnable. He was a completed masterpiece, a man who had mastered the known world of religious science and stood as a paragon of piety and learning. His journey was seemingly over. All that remained was a life of teaching from the pinnacle of his achievement. Then came the breaking. His name was Shams of Tabriz, a wandering mystic who cared nothing for the architecture of the intellect and everything for the raw, unmediated experience of the divine. He was not a builder, but a demolisher of idols, and the greatest idol he came to destroy was Rumi's own perfected self-image. Their meeting in 1244 was the first swing of the hammer. Shams, through his paradoxical wisdom and spiritual fire, revealed to Rumi that his fortress of knowledge was, in fact, a gilded cage, cutting him off from the wild, infinite sky of God's love. The revelation cracked the foundations of Rumi's world. Willingly, he stepped out of his fortress and into the fire of Shams's companionship. He surrendered his public life, his scholarly authority, and the admiration of his students to become a novice once more in the school of love. This radical act of self-emptying was seen as a betrayal by his followers. Their jealousy and resentment became a relentless pressure, a campaign of slander that ultimately drove Shams away from Konya. The first crack had become a painful fissure. Rumi's grief was the cry of a man watching his world break apart. The brief, hopeful reunion after Shams was brought back from Damascus only served to make the final shattering all the more devastating. The murder of Shams in 1248, a dark conspiracy of envy, was the final catastrophic blow. The fortress was reduced to a pile of rubble. Rumi was left with nothing but the ruins of his former life, the ghost of a murdered friend, and a heart that was not just broken, but annihilated. It is a moment that human nature dreads above all others, the moment of total loss, of absolute desolation. But it was in this very abyss that Rumi discovered the secret. When all the external structures of his faith had been demolished, he was forced to find the God who lives not in buildings, but in the empty spaces. When the mirror of his beloved friend was taken from him, he was forced to find the divine image within himself. The ruin was not empty, it was filled with the presence of the beloved. The breaking was not a destruction, but an opening. His broken heart became a gateway through which a torrent of divine inspiration could flow. This is the moment the poet of love was truly born. His pain became poetry, his longing became the whirling dance, and his loss became the foundation of a universal message of divine love. The Divani Shams-e Tabrizi is a celebration of this beautiful brokenness, a collection of songs from a heart that had been shattered into 1,000 pieces and found that every piece could reflect the sun. The Masnavi is a guidebook on how to navigate the ruins, how to find the treasure buried beneath the rubble of the ego. Rumi's life teaches us to stop fearing the breaking. It shows that our moments of greatest devastation are our moments of greatest potential. The pain that cracks open our hearts is the same pain that allows the light to pour in. He did not find God despite his loss. He found God through his loss. The ruins were not an obstacle on his path, they were the path. His story is an eternal testament that the soul is not perfected when it is whole and untouched, but when it has been shattered by love and discovers that in its very brokenness it is finally and completely open to the divine. We're all seekers, charting a course toward a distant shore we call truth, or God, or enlightenment. We draw our maps from the books we read, the teachers we follow, and the beliefs we inherit. Jalaluddin Rumi, the great 13th century scholar, was a master cartographer of the soul. His maps were the finest in the Islamic world, drawn from the deep wells of theology, jurisprudence, and scripture. From his esteemed position in Konya, he guided countless others, his finger tracing the safe, established routes to paradise. His own journey seemed complete. He had arrived at the destination of knowledge and lived there as a respected master. But then he met a man who told him to burn the maps. The man was Shams of Tabriz, a mystic who navigated not by the stars of doctrine, but by the sun within his own heart. He was a wanderer who knew that the territory of the divine is a living, breathing landscape, not a static chart. His encounter with Rumi was a profound and disruptive revelation. Shams showed the master cartographer that his perfect maps were just drawings of a place he had never truly visited. The direct experience of the divine was an ocean, and Rumi had been content to study its currents on a piece of paper. The shock of this discovery compelled Rumi to abandon his map-making. He turned his back on the world of scholarship and plunged into the ocean of spiritual companionship with Shams. For a time, he had a new compass, the living presence of his friend, who was for him a direct reflection of the divine. But this reliance on an external guide was to be stripped from him as well. The jealousy of Rumi's disciples, who still clung to the old maps and resented the man who had burned them, created a storm of animosity that drove Shams away. Rumi was left adrift, lost in a sea of grief. Even after bringing Shams back, the storm did not subside. The final act of the disciples' envy, the murder of Shams, was the shipwreck. The compass was gone, the ship was splintered. Rumi was left with nothing but the wreckage, tossed in a merciless ocean of loss. It was in this state of being utterly and completely lost, with no maps, no compass, and no vessel, that he finally discovered the true art of navigation. He discovered that the destination was not a distant shore, but the ocean itself. He realized that the divine he had been seeking in an external guide was the very water that held him, the very air he breathed. The devastating loss of Shams forced him to stop looking for a reflection of God and to merge with the reality of God. He found the divine not by charting a course, but by dissolving into the sea. This dissolution was the birth of his creative genius. The ocean began to speak through him. The result was the Divani Shams of Tabriz, a collection of poetry that reads like the logbook of a soul who has surrendered to the waves. The whirling of the summer became his way of moving with the currents of divine love, a dance of joyous drowning. His great work, the Masnavi, became a new kind of map. Not a chart of fixed routes, but a description of the ocean's moods, its depths, its storms, and its profound, life-giving power. It was a map that showed others how to burn their own maps. Rumi's story is a profound lesson in spiritual navigation. It teaches that at a certain point on the journey, all external guides and inherited beliefs must be let go. The reliance on the certainties of the mind must give way to the terrifying and liberating uncertainty of the heart. He found God not by perfecting his knowledge of the path, but by having the courage to become gloriously, completely, and finally lost. He discovered that the ruin of the shipwreck is the beginning of the real journey, and that the only way to reach the shore is to realize you are, and always have been, a part of the infinite, magnificent ocean. The human quest for meaning is a quest for light in the darkness. We build lamps of philosophy, we light candles of religious ritual, all to illuminate our path and hold the shadows at bay. Jalaluddin Rumi was a master of this light. As one of the most brilliant religious scholars of his age, his mind was a dazzling chandelier, casting the light of reason and tradition into every corner of existence. In the great city of Konya, he was a beacon of knowledge, a man whose sermons and teachings brought comfort and clarity to thousands. His was a world without shadows, a life illuminated by the steady flame of intellectual certainty. Then he met a man who was not a lamp, but a thunderbolt. He was Shams of Tabriz, a wild mystic who came not to add to Rumi's light, but to extinguish it, plunging him into a darkness more profound than any he had ever known. Shams knew a secret that the scholar did not, that the lamps we build to see God are the very things that blind us to a greater light. His meeting with Rumi was a shattering of the chandelier. Through his spiritual power and unsettling wisdom, he showed Rumi that the light of the intellect was a pale imitation of the brilliant, blinding radiance of the divine sun. To see this sun, Rumi had to be willing to let his own light die. He did so willingly, stepping into the shadow of his new master, abandoning his public role to absorb the lessons of this new, terrifying illumination. For a while, Shams himself became Rumi's light, a human sun around which Rumi's entire existence began to orbit. But the path of the mystic demands that we learn to see in the dark without any external source of light. The jealousy of Rumi's followers provided the catalyst for this final, crucial lesson. Their hatred first drove Shams away, giving Rumi his first taste of the night. Then, after a brief return, their conspiracy to murder Shams extinguished the light for good. This was the ultimate darkness. Rumi was plunged into the abyss of total loss. The sun had been torn from his sky. The world was plunged into a starless, moonless night of the soul. He was blind, heartbroken, and utterly alone. It was in this perfect, impenetrable darkness that his real eyes began to open. When there was nothing left to see, he began to see. He discovered an inner light, a radiant sun that had been hidden deep within his own soul, its brilliance obscured by the chandelier of his mind and even by the reflected light of his friendship with Shams. He realized that the divine light he sought was not something to be acquired, but something to be uncovered. The loss of everything he held dear was the act of uncovering. The darkness was not an absence of light, it was the condition for the revealing of it. This discovery was an explosion of inner radiance that manifested as his poetry. The Divan-e-Shams I Tabrizi is not a collection of poems written about the light. It is the light itself, pouring out from a source that had been unblocked by catastrophic loss. The dance of the Sama was the physical expression of this inner sun, a whirling that radiated light and love into the world. The Masnavi was his later, more measured attempt to teach others how to find their own inner light, not by building better lamps, but by having the courage to enter the darkness of self-surrender. Rumi's journey redefines the nature of enlightenment. It is not the banishing of darkness, but the discovery of the light that shines within it. It teaches that our greatest moments of spiritual blindness, our periods of profoundest despair and loss, are often the necessary prelude to true vision. God did not meet Rumi in the well-lit halls of his scholarship. He ambushed him in the dark. The ruin of his world was the clearing of the sky, the extinguishing of every candle, so that he could finally see the eternal, uncreated sun burning at the center of his own being. Every seeker begins as a student, sitting at the feet of a master, absorbing the wisdom of a tradition. We are given a name, a lineage, a set of practices. This is the path of discipleship, a necessary and honorable stage of the journey. Jalaluddin Rumi, despite his own great learning, became the ultimate disciple. He had already inherited a profound scholarly lineage from his father and his teachers. But when he met the wandering dervish Shams of Tabriz, he underwent a second, more radical initiation. He submitted himself completely to this new, wilder master, effectively becoming a spiritual child once more. He took every teaching from Shams, not as a subject to be analyzed, but as a fire to be absorbed. His entire identity became the disciple of Shams. This devotion was absolute. For Rumi, Shams was the window through which he saw God. His spiritual life was defined by his relationship to his master. But what happens when the master disappears? The path of mysticism demands that the disciple must, at some point, cease to be a disciple and become the path itself. The window must shatter so that the student can become the vista. The violent and tragic end of his friendship with Shams was this shattering. The murder of his master was not just a personal tragedy, it was a spiritual crisis of the highest order. The one he had followed, the one who had defined his entire spiritual world, was gone. The lineage was broken. He was an orphan in the school of love. For a time he was lost in the grief of this orphanhood, searching for the ghost of his master in the streets of Damascus. But the profound realization that awaited him there was the final graduation. He understood that the master he was seeking was no longer an external person, but an internal reality. The wisdom of Shams had not been lost. It had been fully integrated, planted so deeply within Rumi's soul that it had become Rumi himself. He no longer needed to sit at the feet of Shams because he had become the feet. He no longer needed to look through the window because he had become the room with a view. "My master is of me," he could now say, "for I am woven of his soul." This was the moment that the disciple died and the master was born. But Rumi did not become a master in the same way he had been a scholar, dispensing knowledge from a position of authority. His mastery was of a new and radical kind. He became a master of annihilation, a guide who taught not by accumulation but by subtraction. His poetry, the Divan, was a testament to this, for he signed it with his master's name, an act of supreme humility that was also an expression of supreme union. His dance, the Sama, was a teaching in which the ego is rhythmically dissolved until only the divine center remains. His great teaching poem, the Masnavi, was a call for every seeker to embark on the same journey from discipleship to mastery, a journey that culminates not in finding a master, but in discovering the master within. Rumi's story shows that the most profound teachers are those who make themselves obsolete. Shams's greatest teaching was his own disappearance. It was a brutal, final lesson that forced his student to stop looking for a guide and to start embodying the guidance. The ruin of Rumi's discipleship was the necessary condition for the birth of his own unique and universal mastery. It teaches us that at the highest stages of the spiritual path, we must be willing to let go of even our most beloved guides. The role of the true master is not to be followed forever, but to lead us to the place where we can stand on our own, not in the shadow of their greatness, but in the light of our own awakened soul. The ultimate tribute to the master is to become him. In the silent language of the heart, there are two fundamental states, fullness and emptiness. We spend our lives striving for fullness. We fill our minds with knowledge, our homes with possessions, our days with activity. We believe that spiritual attainment is also a process of filling ourselves with virtue, with prayer, with good deeds. Rumi began as a man of ultimate fullness. His mind was a treasure chest overflowing with the jewels of Islamic scholarship. His social life was full, surrounded by adoring students and a respectful community. His spiritual life was full, structured by the rich traditions of his faith. He was a vessel filled to the brim, with no space for anything new to enter. The arrival of Shams of Tabriz was the beginning of a great and terrifying emptying. Shams was a master of the void, a man who understood that God is found not in what we possess, but in the empty space where our possessions used to be. The spiritual training he gave Rumi was not an addition, but a subtraction. He emptied Rumi of his intellectual pride, his reliance on dogma, and his identity as a great scholar. This process was a kind of spiritual ruin, a dismantling of the structures that had defined Rumi's world. The most painful part of this emptying was the disappearance of Shams himself. Love had filled Rumi's heart in a way that knowledge never could, and then that love was brutally ripped away. The murder of Shams created the ultimate void, a hollow ache of absence in the center of Rumi's being. He was left utterly empty, stripped of his teacher, his friend, his certainties, and his joy. He was a ruin in the truest sense of the word, a structure from which all life and purpose had been evacuated. And it was here, in the midst of this perfect emptiness, that he made the most profound discovery. The void was not a void. The emptiness was not empty. It was a dynamic, creative, and sacred space. It was the womb of the divine. He realized that the vessel of the self must be emptied for it to be filled with the wine of God's presence. His grief had carved out a space within him vast enough to contain the entire cosmos. From this creative emptiness, his poetry began to flow, not as a product of his full mind, but as an echo from his empty heart. The Divan-i Shams of Tabriz is a testament to the power of this void, a collection of songs born from absence, celebrating a presence that can only be felt when everything else is gone. The whirling dance of the summer is the physical embodiment of this principle. The dancer creates a still point, an empty center, around which the entire universe revolves. In the stillness of that inner void, the dervish finds union with God. The Masnavi is a 6-volume exploration of this sacred emptiness, teaching through endless stories the art of letting go, of dying to the self, of becoming nothing in order to become everything. Rumi's journey is a powerful counter-narrative to our culture of accumulation. It suggests that spiritual poverty is the greatest wealth. It teaches that our moments of greatest emptiness, our experiences of loss, grief, and despair are not failures, but invitations. They are the moments when the divine architect is clearing the ground, demolishing the old, cramped structures of the ego to build something far more magnificent in their place. He found God not when his life was full, but when it was utterly, completely, and gloriously empty. The ruin of his world was the clearing of a sacred space, and in the silence of that space, he finally heard the eternal music of the beloved. There is a love that comforts and a love that annihilates. We seek the first, a safe harbor, a gentle warmth. But the mystics speak of the second, a consuming fire that burns away the lover until only the beloved remains. The story of Rumi is the story of his initiation into this terrifying and transformative fire. Before Shams, Rumi's relationship with the divine was one of scholarly reverence. It was a love built on respect, obedience, and intellectual admiration, a safe and well-regulated fire contained within the hearth of Orthodox tradition. It was a love that illuminated his world without threatening to burn it down. Shams of Tabriz was the personification of the second kind of love. He was not a gentle flame, he was a conflagration. The love he introduced to Rumi was not about comfort, it was about dissolution. It was an all-consuming passion, an ishq, that demanded not just Rumi's attention, but his entire being. The friendship between them was this fire in action. In the heat of their companionship, the carefully constructed persona of Jalaluddin, the scholar, began to melt away. His pride, his reputation, his very sense of self, all were fuel for this sacred fire. This process was excruciating and ecstatic, but the fire was too intense for the world around them. The jealousy of Rumi's students acted as a wind, fanning the flames but also threatening to scatter them. The disappearance and murder of Shams was the moment the fire seemed to be extinguished, leaving behind only cold ash and darkness. This was Rumi's darkest night, the ruin of a love that had become the center of his universe. He was left with the ashes of his heart. But the nature of this divine fire is that it does not die. It merely goes underground, burning its way into the deepest strata of the soul. In the solitude of his grief, Rumi discovered that the fire had not been extinguished, it had been internalized. The love for Shams had been a catalyst, a spark that had ignited a much greater fire within Rumi himself, the fire of divine love. He no longer needed the external spark, he had become the flame. His being was now the furnace. This inner conflagration was the source of his poetic genius. The verses of the Divan are not descriptions of the fire, they are the sparks and flames themselves, flying off from a soul that is burning. The whirling of the Sama is the dance of the flame, a vortex of spiritual energy that draws everything into its transformative heat. The Masnavi is a manual on tending this fire, on how to feed it with the wood of the ego, and how to use its light to navigate the path to God. Rumi taught that this annihilating love is the ultimate reality. It is the force that created the universe and the power that draws every soul back to its source. It is a love that is terrifying to the ego, for its entire purpose is to burn the illusion of separation away. Love's flame is when the heart is set on fire, he wrote. It burns everything but the beloved's desire. The ruin of Rumi's life was not a tragedy, it was a purification by fire. The structures of his old self had to be burned to the ground so that the indestructible essence of his soul, an essence made of pure love, could be revealed. His story is an invitation to move closer to the fire. It asks us to consider that the safe, comfortable love we so often seek may be keeping us from the transformative, annihilating love that our souls truly crave. It is a call to have the courage to be consumed, to be reduced to ashes, in the faith that from those ashes, like the mythical phoenix, we will be reborn, not as a seeker of love, but as love itself.